superiors and their social inferiors. But this would be only a half-truth. One finds in him, side by side and unreconciled, doctrines which foreshadow those of developed capitalism and doctrines which adumbrate a more nearly socialistic outlook. It is easy to misrepresent him by one-sided quotations on this topic as on most others. I will put down, in the order in which they occur, Locke's principal dicta on the subject of property. We are told first that every man has private property in the produce of his own labor, or at least should have. In pre-industrial days, this maxim was not so unrealistic as it has since become. Urban production was mainly by handicraftsmen who owned their tools and sold their produce. As for agricultural production, it was held by the school to which Locke belonged that peasant proprietorship would be the best system. He states that a man may own as much land as he can till, but not more. He seems blandly unaware that in all the countries of Europe the realization of this program would be hardly possible without a bloody revolution. Everywhere the bulk of agricultural land belonged to aristocrats, who exacted from the farmers either a fixed proportion of the produce, often a half, or a rent which could be varied from time to time. The former system prevailed in France and Italy, the latter in England. Farther east, in Russia and Prussia, the workers were serfs, who worked for the landowner and had virtually no rights. The old system was ended in France by the French Revolution, in northern Italy and western Germany by the conquests of the French revolutionary armies. Serfdom was abolished in Prussia as a result of defeat by Napoleon, and in Russia as a result of defeat in the Crimean War. But in both countries the aristocrats retained their landed estates. In East Prussia this system, though drastically controlled by the Nazis, has survived to the present day. In Russia, and what are now Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, the aristocrats were dispossessed by the Russian Revolution. In Hungary, Romania, and Poland they survived. In eastern Poland they were liquidated by the Soviet government in 1940. The Soviet government, however, has done everything in its power to substitute collective farming rather than peasant proprietorship throughout Russia. In England, the development has been more complex. In Locke's day, the position of the rural labourer was mitigated by the existence of commons, on which he had important rights, which enabled him to raise a considerable part of his food himself. This system was a survival from the Middle Ages, and was viewed with disapproval by modern-minded men who pointed out that from the point of view of production it was wasteful. Accordingly, there was a movement for enclosure of commons, which began under Henry VIII and continued under Cromwell, but did not become strong until about 1750. From that time onward, for about 90 years, one common after another was enclosed, and handed over to the local landowners. Each enclosure required an Act of Parliament, and the aristocrats who controlled both Houses of Parliament ruthlessly used their legislative power to enrich themselves while thrusting agricultural labourers down to the verge of starvation. Gradually, owing to the growth of industry, the position of agricultural labourers improved, since otherwise they could not be prevented from migrating to the towns. At present, as a result of the taxation introduced by Lloyd George, the aristocrats have been compelled to part with most of their rural property. But those who also own urban or industrial property have been able to hang on to their estates. There has been no sudden revolution, but a gradual transition which is still in progress. At present, those aristocrats who are still rich owe their wealth to urban or industrial property. This long development may be regarded, except in Russia, as in accordance with Locke's principles. The odd thing is that he could announce doctrines requiring so much revolution before they could be put into effect, and yet show no sign that he thought the system existing in his day unjust, or that he was aware of its being different from the system that he advocated. The labour theory of value, that is, the doctrine that the value of a product depends upon the labour expended upon it, which some attribute to Karl Marx and others to Ricardo, is to be found in Locke, and was suggested to him by a line of predecessors stretching back to Aquinas. As Tawney says, summarizing scholastic doctrine, the essence of the argument was that payment may properly be demanded by the craftsmen who make the goods, or by the merchants who transport them, for both labour in their vocation and serve the common need. The unpardonable sin is that of the speculator or middleman who snatches private gain by the exploitation of public necessities. The true descendant of the doctrines of Aquinas is the labor theory of value. The last of the schoolmen was Karl Marx. The labor theory of value has two aspects, one ethical, the other economic. That is to say, it may assert that the value of a product ought to be proportional to the labor expended on it, or that in fact the labor regulates the price. The latter doctrine is only approximately true, as Locke recognizes. 9/10 of value, he says, is due to labor, but as to the other tenth he says nothing. It is labor, he says, that puts the difference of value on everything. He instances land in America occupied by Indians, which has almost no value because the Indians do not cultivate it. He does not seem to realize that land may acquire value as soon as people are willing to work on it, and before they have actually done so. If you own a piece of desert land on which somebody else finds oil, you can sell it for a good price without doing any work on it. As was natural in his day, he does not think of such cases, but only of agriculture. Peasant proprietorship, which he favors, is inapplicable to such things as large-scale mining, which require expensive apparatus and many workers. The principle that a man has a right to the produce of his own labor is useless in an industrial civilization. Suppose you are employed in one operation in the manufacture of Ford cars. How is anyone to estimate what proportion of the total output is due to your labor? Or suppose you are employed by a railway company in the transport of goods. Who can decide what share you shall be deemed to have in the production of the goods? Such considerations have led those who wish to prevent the exploitation of labor to abandon the principle of the right to your own produce in favor of more socialistic methods of organizing production and distribution. The labor theory of value has usually been advocated from hostility to some class regarded as predatory. The schoolmen, insofar as they held it, did so from opposition to usurers, who were mostly Jews. Ricardo held it in opposition to landowners, Marx to capitalists. But Locke seems to have held it in a vacuum, without hostility to any class. His only hostility is to monarchs, but this is unconnected with his views on value. Some of Locke's opinions are so odd that I cannot see how to make them sound sensible. He says that a man must not have so many plums that they are bound to go bad before he and his family can eat them. But he may have as much gold and as many diamonds as he can lawfully get, because gold and diamonds do not go bad. It does not occur to him that the man who has the plums might sell them before they go bad. He makes a great deal of the imperishable character of the precious metals, which he says are the source of money and inequality of fortune. He seems in an abstract and academic way to regret economic inequality, but he certainly does not think that it would be wise to take such measures as might prevent it. No doubt he was impressed, as all the men of his time were, by the gains to civilization that were due to rich men, chiefly as patrons of art and letters. The same attitude exists in modern America, where science and art are largely dependent upon the benefactions of the very rich. To some extent, civilization is furthered by social injustice. This fact is the basis of what is most respectable in conservatism. E. Checks and balances. The doctrine that the legislative, executive, and judicial functions of government should be kept separate is characteristic of liberalism. It arose in England in the course of resistance to the Stuarts, and is clearly formulated by Locke, at least as regards the legislature and the executive. The legislative and executive must be separate, he says, to prevent abuse of power. It must, of course, be understood that when he speaks of the legislature, he means Parliament, and when he speaks of the executive, he means the king. At least, this is what he means emotionally, whatever he may logically intend to mean. Accordingly, he thinks of the legislature as virtuous, while the executive is usually wicked. The legislative, he says, must be supreme, except that it must be removable by the community. It is implied that, like the English House of Commons, the legislative is to be elected from time to time by popular vote. The condition that the legislative is to be removable by the people, if taken seriously, condemns the part allowed by the British Constitution in Locke's day to king and lords as part of the legislative power. In all well-framed governments, Locke says, the legislative and executive are separate. The question therefore arises, what is to be done when they conflict? If the executive fails to summon the legislative at the proper times, we are told, the executive is at war with the people and may be removed by force. This